Hey, this is Cedric Youngelman, your host of the Bitcoin Matrix Podcast. Thank you so much for checking out my show, where we have philosophical conversations about the economic, cultural, and psychological implications of Bitcoin. Please make sure that you're subscribed to the Bitcoin Matrix. And if you're watching this on YouTube, smash that like button so that more people see it. And put those notifications on so you don't miss out on fresh and dope content. This episode with Clemenza from the Meat Mafia about the fundamental problems in our food and healthcare system and how they advocate for carnivore and animal-based forms of eating is brought to you by River. I love River because they keep shipping, and they are a Bitcoin-only company that makes it simple to leave the next generation better off than our own. Plus, you can set up zero-fee DCA. To get started and find out for yourself, use the link in the show notes and get up to $10,000 free when you buy Bitcoin and miners at river.com. There's no better time than now to get your sats off your exchange. My favorite hardware wallet is the Cold Card from CoinKite. It's definitely worth learning how to use. CoinKite is a leader in security and hardware manufacturer, established block 141,000, maker of some of the most iconic Bitcoin products, such as OpenDime, Cold Card, Block Clock, Sats Card, Tap Signer, and Sats Chip. You can get a 5% discount on all of this by using the referral link in the show notes. Bitcoin 2023 ticket prices increase Friday at midnight. Lock in your ticket to the biggest Bitcoin event of the year before prices go up. Education, celebration, and hyper Bitcoinization will once again be on the agenda. I hope to see you there May 18th to 20th and grab an ice cold beer. To get 10% off your ticket and help support me and the show, use the code MATRIX at checkout. And now, let's enter the Bitcoin Matrix with Clemenza from the Meat Mafia.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Joining me tonight is Harry, aka Clemenza, from the Meat Mafia, which is leading the red meat renaissance. Clemenza, welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix Podcast. How are you?
Cedric, great to be here, man. Excited for this combo.
Yeah, man, I'm super excited to chat. It's a very interesting subject, what you're bringing to the table here. I'd like to learn a bit about what were you doing before the Meat Mafia?
Yeah, so I got my degree in finance. So I went to school in Boston, went to a smaller school, about 2,000 people, Babson College. And the school is very focused on entrepreneurship. I ended up getting a degree in finance and then quickly thereafter got a job in real estate. So I was doing investment management before I started any of this stuff with the Meat Mafia. So very different trajectory, but my passion was really around health all along. As soon as I started working on the Meat Mafia stuff, really sort of realized that. I played college baseball, so that definitely played a factor in kind of my own personal health journey. It was definitely something that was important to me growing up as well. Played a bunch of sports. Training was always kind of the core to that. And then, after baseball, was kind of just focused on getting a job and trying to find like a good career path. And worked at a company for 6 years, had some really great experience. So I think, part of my background was working in a real estate investment company that was really looking at the world view through a global lens. So we had offices in London, Hong Kong, Amsterdam. I actually got to work in our Amsterdam office for a little bit. And I think that gave me a perspective and view on the world that was a little bit different. So we were, our responsibility at this company was to invest pension funds money in real estate in the US, but we got to talk to our clients and our business partners kind of across the world. And so it made me very attuned and aware of like what was happening in the world, what trends were occurring in the financial markets. So my interest in just the world of money definitely started there and was kind of born from that. And then I kind of married that with what was my true passion, which was, the health worlds. And I think for me, like I ended up leaving my company as kind of the COVID lockdowns were starting to get, a little bit tighter. Corporate policy was starting to shift. And I was just kind of looking for my next step. And I had been thinking about going to a different real estate company, but kind of a unique opportunity presented itself to work with. I was originally applying for a chief of staff role for a company down here in Austin where I am now. And I was going to be working with as like the right-hand man for this entrepreneur who had bought and sold a bunch of companies and was doing a lot of really cool things in the health space. So that actually didn't end up panning out, which was, kind of for the best. And I ended up doing my own thing. But that was kind of the quick backstory of kind of how I've gotten to working on the Meat Mafia stuff.
Sure. That's awesome. So then, I mean, I heard you mention you're a college baseball athlete growing up, training. So what was your diet like growing up, or just your attitude towards food?
Yeah, I was actually like, my attitude towards food was I think I was like pretty advanced in terms of thinking about food and nutrition as like a big part of the overall performance matrix. But for me, I was definitely like weightlifting first, nutrition second, but I still think that I was doing like a lot of the right things. So I was lucky enough to come from a family where my mom was on top of it. She was really like a great cook and like very attentive to like putting good meals on the table, but there were still things that like looking back that she did that, now knowing and doing what I'm doing now, I'm like, oh man, I wish she had replaced the skim milk with raw milk. But no, like I think like my lens on nutrition was pretty advanced from an early age. Like in college, I was the guy who was like doing the paleo diet and trying to like factor in how nutrition was going to affect performance, where like a lot of the other guys on the team like weren't as focused on that. So I would say that it was definitely something that I was thinking about from an early age, but I remember like in high school, I was playing football, playing baseball, like very active. And so like our school lunches were not great. Like there were a lot of like subs, chips, pizzas. And as an athlete, you're just like, yeah, like I'm going to eat this because like I've got practice in a game and, it's what they're giving to you. So I still like, and I did have some, some like health, I looking back could realize that I had some like health implications with this. Like I had some pretty bad cystic acne from that. And like, for me, it's very clear that was dietarily derived. And, like I took some medication to get to like clear it up. But for me, like that was kind of like the, like looking back, like aha moment, like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to this nutrition equation than I even realize and appreciate. And like, I can't imagine how many other people are dealing with this sort of thing, especially younger kids who it's not really taught to you, like, what the proper diet is, how to eat a really nutritious, nutrient dense meals, like, and it's hard. So, but I was attuned to it. My mom was like definitely on top of it. So I think that it was an important factor for me. And then kind of like, as I grew older and got into that job, working long hours, like I wasn't as focused on it. I was eating like the food that was in the food court, like eating meals that were healthy, but I was still like going for like the snacks in the kitchen and things like that. So I quickly realized like working a 9-to-5 job, longer hours, like my willpower wasn't always there. And I was kind of like losing that athletic edge in terms of like what my body felt like. And when COVID hit, I got like fully back on top of it. And even before that, I was like the months leading up to it, I was experimenting with a carnivore diet and had like started to feel great. And then COVID hit, and I just used that as my excuse to like shut everything off and like really focus on my nutrition. And that's when like all the light bulbs went off, and I had been going down a few different rabbit holes in terms of like the food system in general. And so like my own personal health journey was also like in parallel evolving with my thinking on like, oh, what's really happening in the food system. So that's like where the spark really started for me in terms of like really running at this nutritional journey, both like on a personal level, but like, you know, kind of like my life's mission at this point, which is like thinking about the food system from a little bit of a bigger lens.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And it made me think a lot about when I was a kid. I remember going to like the local pizza place, and there was a food pyramid, poster, and it was bread on the bottom. So 3-4 servings of bread. I'm making these numbers up, and 1 or 2 servings of milk, and 1 or 2 servings of fruit and veggies, and 1 or 2 servings of meat, or maybe just 1 serving of meat. And then on each of those servings was represented by the pepperoni, the mozzarella, the tomato sauce, and the crust. And so, pizza was therefore an FDA approved meal. I remember, maybe coming home from soccer practice and being starving. And if there wasn't like leftovers, from like dinner, like, yeah, I'd eat a sleeve of Ritz crackers or something, and just thinking like calories are calories, and they're in my house. They must be good for me, or the same. I mean, what else, how do you frame that up in terms of like how you were eating younger and maybe kids eat versus, like you were mentioning, like the school lunches, the options are terrible.
Yeah, and they're usually like very hyper palatable foods, right? Like foods that just taste good, they're salty, they have some sort of combination of, salt, sugar, and fat. And I think, from like the 60s and 70s onward, when that food pyramid was created, it's kind of been a race to the bottom in terms of food quality. So like there's just a lot of products out there now that are kind of like masked and guised as like these foods, but they're not really, the types of foods that you would want to be eating if you're trying to be, optimally healthy. And I think it's funny too, like food has changed. Like pizza in Italy now, like today, is made with really high quality ingredients. The grain is processed differently, so we actually digest it differently. Like most, and I'm speaking in generalizations, but like the quality there is different than the quality here on average. And so I think there's something to that as well, where it's like, even our like quote unquote junk food is different than what it is in other places, like where like maybe it's like a little bit more of like part of their traditional culture. So but yeah, like back to the question, like kids just have massive exposure to all of these, junk foods, fake foods nowadays, and it's really being marketed to them in a really aggressive way, almost in a predatory way. Like there's one example that I think of often, and it's a commercial, a Pepsi commercial, where Beyonce is walking into a gas station, and there's this kid who's listening to Beyonce, who's like, I guess like his idol or crush, and she walks past him, or her hair blows back, and he's listening to her song like through his headphones, and he has this look on his face as she's drinking a Pepsi. It's like almost kind of like programming these kids to think in terms of like, what their celebrity idol is doing, like, oh, they should be doing that as well. And like there's multiple examples of that if you just go back through and look at marketing for any of these brands, Kellogg, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, they're all out there. And I think it's something that should be looked at like a little bit more like critically now. Like it's a huge part of why so many kids are now like getting sicker and sicker and have we have this rise in childhood obesity. It's really just a lot of the programming that was happening during the 80s and 90s with these food commercials.
That's interesting. I mean, I think about marketing for kids, and be like Mike and drink Gatorade during sports. Yeah. And I mean, that's just sugar water. It's no better than soda. Europe, I've heard people, I mean, I was in Europe 20 something years ago or something, but I've heard people even recently comment about going to Europe and just eating and drinking whatever they want and losing weight, and not really understanding why. We'll get into a little bit more diets, Mediterranean diet, paleo, things like that, keto, but tell me about red meat and why it's so good for you. And
yeah, I think the big thing with red meat is that it is a complete meal in itself. So it has everything that you would need to sustain yourself. And so like when I think of meat, I think of really high quality saturated fats, protein, and then essentially like, there's no carbohydrates in it. So meat in itself from that fat source, like you can really sustain yourself. And, it has all the vitamin minerals you need. It's high in B12, high in all the vitamin Bs. And like, for the most part, our standard American diet is void of a lot of these nutrients and minerals. So like from a macronutrient perspective and a micronutrient perspective, it's complete. And I think that's like pretty rare for most foods. Like you can't say that about a lot of foods. Like if you were to just eat spinach or kale, you're going to be missing at least vitamin B12 and a lot of other things. So from that perspective, I think it's a superfood. And it also, the way I think about nutrition is through the lens of nutrient density and satiety. And when you eat these foods that are high in saturated fat, you're satiated. Like you don't have the cravings that you would have if you're on a high carbohydrate diet where you're really exposed to the more like higher uptake, fast uptake carbs that you kind of need to burn immediately. Otherwise your body ends up storing it as fat. So like for me, just that satiety factor and nutrient density is kind of like the crux of why I think like beef and other animal proteins and animal food sources should be the cornerstone of your diet.
Sure. So then let's unpack a little bit more about red meat. I mean, what about this? You mentioned saturated fats, and what about even like cholesterol? Can too much of this cause heart attacks or just, ill health effects?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. So one of the things that we started writing about early on in our kind of journey with the Meat Mafia is a lot of the food history and things that have happened over the course of the last several decades that have steered the narrative around food. And one of those is cholesterol. And so cholesterol during the 60s became kind of the villain of all foods, and wrongly so, I think. So someone who's done a great job of unpacking this is Nina Teicholz. And so, she told the story of how Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack during the 60s. And then after his heart attack, he was really focused on figuring out what exactly was causing the rise, because it wasn't just him who was struggling with this, the rise of heart disease in the US. And so what he ended up doing was creating the dietary guidelines, which was founded and really driven by a guy by the name of Ansel Keys. And he came up with a 7-country study, which was his analysis of 21 countries, and he boiled it down to 7, essentially creating cherry picking the data and creating his own trend analysis based on that. And so he drew a correlation between higher saturated fat diets and heart disease. And so like that's kind of what the prevailing nutritional guidelines were based on. But I think when you look a little bit closer, it's hard to call cholesterol the actual villain. And I think what I've learned is that it's much more related to metabolic disorder, which I think is driven through diet that's high in highly processed grains, sugar, and oils, like seed oils. And that actually, like how that affects your body is it makes your body more susceptible to having cholesterol clog up in your arteries, in your arterial wall. But cholesterol is really like this amazing foundational, fundamental molecule in the body that is like a life-giving molecule. So what I mean by that is it's like the foundation, or it is the foundation of a lot of or most of your hormonal functions in the body. Your body actually makes all of the cholesterol it needs throughout the day, and then it self-regulates for dietary cholesterol. And like for the most part, dietary cholesterol actually doesn't really like get absorbed too much in the body. Like it's mostly just the cholesterol that's being created in your body from your liver to begin with. So there's a lot of interesting research that's coming out now. A guy by the name of, I'm blanking on his name, Dave Feldman, is doing a lot of research right now on kind of like debunking this and kind of taking an interesting approach, because he's an engineer by trade. And so he's coming at it from a third party outsider's perspective from the medical community. And he's addressing it with, I think the criticism that it needs to really like push back on the medical community that's basically accepted this. But it's slowly, I think in 2015, the FDA came out and said that, cholesterol actually isn't, it's not like the problem. So, I think that a lot of the things around cholesterol are pretty overhyped in terms of it being a problem. And I think that even in some data that I've looked at, like older people who have lower cholesterol are at higher risk of mortality than people who are older who have higher levels of cholesterol, because it is that foundational building block of a lot of the hormonal function. So there's a lot there to unpack, but I think like in all, like the cholesterol story has been completely misguided and misled.
Yeah, I think you shared a lot of very interesting and eye-opening information there. So then maybe going in the other direction, how does red meat, play a role in reclaiming your health?
Yeah, I think in today's day and age, we're living in a world of abundance when it comes to food and food-like substances. There's so many different things that you can put in your mouth and consider food that aren't all that healthy for you. So, most people are living, getting their food from a gas station, a Walmart, or some other like convenient spot. Like that's kind of the sad reality. And a lot of these foods are highly processed. And I mentioned, highly processed sugar, highly processed grains, and highly processed fats. And those are really like the things you need to avoid when it comes to being healthy. And I think that in today's world, the people who are going to be healthiest are focused almost as much energy on what to avoid than they are what to actually consume. And so when it comes down to it, if you're avoiding those kind of three categories of kind of like, unhealthy things in the food system and adding in things that are really nutrient dense like beef, just that alone will really, really, really drive strong health outcomes for you.
Sure. So, I mean, maybe looking at it a little bit more from the food industry perspective, what have you seen with the centralization of meat, in particular red meat, and maybe like the meat processors?
Yeah, the centralization in food is staggering. So there's I'll have to link this or send you this link, but there's a really great study that came out. It's called the Food Barons Report 2022 or 2022. And it kind of breaks down where we're at in terms of big multinational companies controlling the food system. And the beef industry is not like pardoned. There's complete control over the beef processing side of the industry. So 80% of beef processing that happens is controlled by four companies. And, that puts a really tough stranglehold on the industry, because even small farmers have to go through a lot of those processors. There really aren't a whole lot of small processors, just because economies of scales just does not support that. And so a lot of small farmers who are, doing 2 to 3 runs to the processor every year, their business isn't significant enough to these processing plants. So they are deprioritized. They have to put their bookings for the processing facilities on the much earlier. And so, they're kind of fighting an uphill battle. And so what that does is it just massively constricts how these smaller, well-run farms are able to operate. And so what we've seen now is kind of this movement towards building up these smaller processing facilities, because that's where the biggest constraint on the beef industry is today. It's not really like a lack of high quality grass-fed, grass-finished beef. It's the fact that these processors really control, in a lot of ways,
Mm.
price through just strong arming these smaller guys. So it's a tough. The food industry as a whole is massively concentrated. Like if you look at chicken genetics are 100% controlled by like two companies, and chicken protein is supposed to represent like 40% of all animal protein that gets consumed in the US by 2030. So it's like there's really not a whole lot of small players in the food system that carry enough weight to like make a meaningful change. And so that's why like these grassroots movements like the Beef Initiative and other initiatives to kind of get people buying more direct, people willing to, and I don't even think they're paying a premium. I think they would be able to, like, if you're buying directly from your farmer, you're able to give them more margin, and then that is able, they're able to kind of stomach the processing fees and things like that. So, it's an industry that is riddled with concentration, and obviously, as you know, a lot of that just stems from the control of incentives and money. So, I would highly recommend reading that Food Barons report as well for anyone listening.
Yeah, and to kind of continue on with this though, but more from maybe the darker side. So, from what I gather, like the meat you're getting at the supermarket, that's decent beef. But maybe there are slight differences from the meat you'd get from your rancher. Maybe just how many parties it's going to touch. Are they even doing anything like process wise? Are they spraying the meat with anything to kind of preserve it longer or anything like that? Or
well, anything that gets sold across state lines needs to go through a USDA facility. So they're all kind of processed the same for the most part, unless you're buying in state directly from your farm and you kind of like can be really close touch. But yeah, I mean, the processing facilities, depending on the size, some of them are processing, thousands and thousands of cattle a day. So like the quality is at scale is a tough thing to solve for. So, the smaller facilities are able to actually care for the animal as it approaches its death. There's a lot of research out there now in terms of, the actual kill of the animal is pretty significant in terms of the hormones that end up in the meat. And what I mean by that is like, if these animals are stressed out as they're going to the processor, their cortisol levels shoot up. And so that is actually represented in some of the meat in meat quality. So, that's just like a small thing, but it definitely plays a factor. So, I think, by and large, if you're buying from your local farmer, they're generally probably, and you can ask about processing and how they're getting it processed, what facility they're using. But by and large, they're not going to these mega processing facilities just because those are typically run by the big four, and like those guys are generally using those. So, but I think the meat in general is typically sprayed with some saline solution as well to preserve it, which is a salt solution. It lets it keep that pink color a little bit more. So anything you're doing to like get to like a more unprocessed version of the meat is better. And I think just if you can get to your food source and talk to your farmer about how they process it, it's a really informative way to just learn more about this whole topic and just figure out, how they're doing things.
what about the notion of there's, if you go to the supermarket and your ground beef, it's not just one cow in there versus what you might get at the rancher?
Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I think it's probably true. I mean, there's only so much ground beef to go around, and it's in these big processing facilities, it's generally just meat getting thrown into a tube processor and it's getting pumped out, especially like the bulk meat. Like if you go to HEB down here as a grocery store, I mean, they sell 10-pound tubes of ground beef. Like, I don't know. I don't know much about this topic, but I would imagine it's probably not all coming from the same cow.
Yeah, I just don't know what the downsides of that. But, switching a little bit of gears, how has like our chicken changed over 50 years?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So in the 50s, there was a contest called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. And this whole this whole topic is really well outlined in a book called The Dorito Effect, which I would highly recommend everyone read. And essentially what they were trying to do is industrialize chicken. So figure out how they can make chicken fatter faster. And so the way they were doing that is giving them feed that put on weight way faster than they were normally able to put on. And so that feed is typically a combination of corn and soy. And what we found over the past several decades is that we've essentially changed the genetics of chicken so that we're using fewer and fewer diversity of breeds. We only have like a handful of breeds that we're using for meat birds now. And they're all kind of eating the same garbage, which is not really a species appropriate diet. Like if you were to let a chicken roam free, it's going to be eating worms and all sorts of different smaller insects and animals. It's not, they are not herbivores by any means, but their diets today are highly concentrated in corn and soy. And so, they're not really eating a species appropriate diet. And for the most part, that's like the entirety of the chicken industry, unless you're getting it from like a local pastured farm. So, chicken is highly commoditized now. The industry itself is really industrialized, and a lot of the chicken industry, like the meat that gets put in a lot of these restaurants and food, like it's not all that high quality chicken. And, kind of the setback on that is, when these chickens are monogastric, meaning they have one stomach, so they digest food similar to the way we do. And so when you're feeding them a diet that's essentially making them turn obese, they're putting that fat on, and that fat is being stored as a type of fat which is a less stable bond of fat. And it's actually, when we consume it, it's very, very easily oxidized. So that creates stress in our body. And so it's almost this like hidden problem in the food system where these chickens are being fed such high levels of corn and soy that the way it's reacting in our body is almost similar to the way that seed oils are reacting in our body. Not to the same magnitude, but it's just another example of like how the industrialized model of food is really not the best representation or best incentive for our underlying health.
Yeah. And I want to read a few facts from your co-host Salazzo's thread about chickens. I think this was the first time you guys came on my radar, or like maybe not the very first time, but this was some thread. Yeah. It's Americans. Yeah. I mean, Americans, the U.S. is obsessed with chicken. We eat 26 billion pounds of chicken a year. We spend almost 30 billion on broiler chickens to eat. And we have an inventory of 518 million chickens. And the average American eats 65 pounds of chicken alone. And I really do feel and relate to what you've been talking about, this sort of this fattening up in the chicken. And modern chicken today is just, it's so dry, bland, and flavorless. And you got to do so many things to make it palatable. And one of the quotes from this is, contrast this into the 1960s, where chicken was considered a delicacy. Famed chef Julia Child had this to say about chicken: chicken should be so good in itself that it is an absolute delight to eat, as a perfectly plain butter roast, saute, or grill. I mean, it's really, there's nothing like that today, or it's very rare, I think. So what are the invisible hand of incentives after World War II as it relates to maybe like fertilizer?
Yeah. So after World War II, we started to think about food in a much more geopolitical way. And so we started, there's a famous expression by the old Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, who said, food is a weapon. And he meant that literally. And so one of the benefits of the US in terms of the commodities or the resources that we have available to us is we have this very rich topsoil in the Midwest. And we use that as a way to export food security to other countries. And that was kind of like the political stance on food after World War II. And it just so happened at the same time after World War II, we had this abundance of ammonia fertilizer that was being used or it was originally being used for weapons. We had all the factories set up for making weapons, and those were easily convertible into, fertilizer factories. And so that made it much easier to put the gas on growing and expanding the farm's output in the US. But, increasing and expanding the farm production in the US meant that the smaller farms really don't stand a chance. Like Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture in the 60s and 70s, has a famous expression that, we're going to farm from fence post to fence post. And that whole mentality, like kind of what I was saying earlier about scale, it's like, it's hard to produce quality at scale. And so that's definitely relevant when it comes to food. And so we really hit the gas on producing a lot of corn, soy, and wheat and exporting that to countries that needed it, that countries that we knew were strategic strongholds for like the US long-term interests. And once you have a country, I mean, this is kind of my own take on it, but like once you have a country who's relying on you for food, they're basically relying on you for everything. Their stability as a nation is entirely dependent on, it's outsourced to another country's production. And I think that was a very tactical play by the US, and we're suffering from that now because food quality has plummeted, and a lot of our farming now is highly concentrated in monocrop agriculture, industrialized systems that are very similar to the financial system in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I can see that. So how and why do you think food companies are now run like tech companies?
Yeah, I really like this topic. So tech companies are known for, essentially coming up with a product, raising a lot of money, and pumping a lot of advertising dollars into promoting products that they could be great products, they could be bad products. At the end of the day, that is essentially very similar to how these food companies are operating now. Cedric, you just froze there for a second. Are you good?
Yeah, you were choppy for a second, so I was just thinking through that.
Yeah, no, all good.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was just saying, tech companies are known for having a product, raising a lot of money, and spending a ton of advertising dollars on those products to acquire customers, regardless of the quality or kind of market demand for whether or not that product is good or bad, or high quality or not high quality. And so I think that food companies do a very similar thing with that in terms of raising a lot of money, having a product that they know that they can sell at scale, and then marketing like crazy to acquire customers, and spending crazy dollar amounts in terms of getting their product in people's hands. And then they flip those companies, sell them to bigger companies, or hold on to them. But for the most part, the big food companies have just taken tech's playbook, or I don't even know if it's fair to say that, because big food has been around for a while as well. But it's definitely seems like a lot of these food companies that are popping up now are not all that high quality products, and they just have endless marketing dollars because they're backed by some sort of VC fund that has put millions and millions of dollars at play. The example that I think of is like Impossible or Beyond Meat. These companies are investing in technology to produce fake meat, and they're also investing insane amounts of ad dollars to get celebrity endorsements. And a lot of times those celebrities are on the cap table and involved with like the actual ownership of those businesses. So their incentives are totally skewed in the wrong direction. And they don't even really know what the quality of the product is that they're promoting. They're just promoting a product that they know eventually, if it does well, they'll be able to sell out and cash out. So, a lot of ways it's not really like this bottom up organic growth of like what a healthy company would do in terms of just creating a product that had organic demand. They're coming at it from a much different perspective of a top-down strategy where they have a product, they can just put the foot on the gas and spend a ton of marketing dollars. So I think that that's kind of big food's playbook, and it hasn't worked out great in some ways for a lot of these fake meat companies, but it's definitely worked for other companies. And it's kind of I think it's a very short-term mindset. It's kind of the downfall of a lot of these VC models when it comes to tech or, food.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of draw a line from like Michael Jordan with Gatorade and to Ashton Kutcher and maybe, Beyond Meat. And the
Yeah.
power, though, of celebrity icons backing these brands, to your point, not knowing what they actually are or how they benefit or not benefit the consumer. What do you then make of sort of the Bayer Monsanto relationship? And maybe you can give a little context to that.
Yeah. So Bayer bought Monsanto. I'm going to get the date wrong.
No worries about that.
Yeah. So Bayer acquired Monsanto just around 10 years ago. And it's an interesting relationship because it's a pharmaceutical company acquiring the top 3 largest agrochemical business in the world. And so, when you think about how these companies kind of are thinking about organizing themselves and positioning themselves for the future, you have to wonder, why is a pharmaceutical company acquiring an agrochemical company that is known for its main staple product, glyphosate, which is Roundup? And Bayer has essentially built this insane business that's monopolistic in a lot of ways, but it's disguised its monopoly through having horizontally integrated businesses that are really kind of exclusive of each other. But when you look at the whole picture, they're very much intertangled. So you have Bayer, who owns this agrochemical that is an herbicide. They're also getting involved with, so on the front end, they're involved with the process of spraying crops and making sure that those crops can grow, create food. They're getting involved with other aspects in the food industry. And then once that food, and we can get into glyphosate as well too, because that's an interesting topic, but once that food's raised, then, the glyphosate itself has essentially kills everything in the soil except the plant. And so that plant then goes off, gets sold. And then Bayer is coming in on the backside when people are sick. They have a whole line of pharmaceuticals that are from that treat, all sorts of things, diabetes, aspirin, things like that, kind of are they're like the bullet and the Band-Aid at the same time, where they have fixed themselves so integrated in the food production side of things, but also kind of like they're so integrated in the sickness industry that they're benefiting from both ends of the spectrum. I think that's highly concerning because they have such power in both. And glyphosate is one of these products that, like, if it went away tomorrow, the food system would just like crumble. We saw that in Sri Lanka. Like, they banned glyphosate overnight and their food system essentially collapsed. Like, the food production was in like complete astray for weeks on end. And that got fixed through some like from geopolitical relationships and people being able to actually like come in and kind of be a backstop. But their own food system in the country was like completely messed up after that, because the entire food system is built on these agrochemicals that are so important for the food production, because like the base, I think it's something like 70% of the crops are sprayed with this stuff. So like without it, they can't, there really is no ability to grow in the soil that those chemicals or that those plants would otherwise be growing in, because the glyphosate, it has basically one role, which is to kill everything in the soil and make sure that those plants can grow. And now we have seeds that are essentially Roundup resistant, which was another like great invention by Monsanto, where they have the spray, they have the seed, and those two pair perfectly for like just creating a ton of money for themselves, but it essentially like desecrates the soil, and just leaves you with kind of that barren, nutrient deprived crop.
Yeah, and it seems like they're almost creating vaccines, and then those vaccines create escape variants, and it's a never-ending cycle. But it's a lot of profit all the way to the end, and they control sort of the seed supply. And I think they even control, or these conglomerates control, a seed bank, a global seed bank, and I mean, that is just some interesting stuff. Are cows hurting the environment?
Yeah, this is another good one. There's been a lot of talk about it, and I think under the current conventional model where cows are cooped up in feedlots, that is very clearly not what's best for the cows. They're not able to freely roam and graze on grass, but it's also absolutely not what's best for the environment. Where cows are incredibly good for the environment is the role that they play as kind of a keystone species, where they graze grass, in a pasture where they're freely able to walk, and then they recycle a lot of the nutrients back into the soil. But the current system definitely promotes a very industrialized view, or industrialized system of cattle production, and I think that it's probably not the best model for the environment. These cows aren't able to do what they're supposed to do, and when they do have the ability to be raised in pasture, like they are at a lot of these regenerative farms. Like we were down at White Oak Pastures, they had a life cycle analysis done on their cattle, and their cattle is actually carbon negative. And that's just one instance of how cattle play a key role in restoring the habitat and the land. One of the cool stories about White Oak Pastures is Will Harris is a 4th generation rancher, and his father was a conventional feedlot rancher, and so he inherited a system that was broken. I mean, he would even say, like, there was no wildlife here before, there was no multi-speciations, there was not like random birds flying in and new species of birds flying in. It was just cattle. The land was destroyed, and then they started thinking about things differently and trying to mimic nature in the way that they raised their animals. And what they noticed was the soil quality vastly improved. It held more water. They went from like 2% organic matter in the soil to 6%. And that increase allows for all sorts of positive externalities to happen when it comes to the environment and the habitats that these animals live in. So it's like the water cycle improves, the microbial cycle improves, the nitrogen cycle improves. You see all sorts of different species coming in. So I think we try to look at these things, or like the modern thinking around these systems is to look at it in a very mechanistic and industrial fashion, where it's like cows are bad for the environment. Of course they are, because they sit there and they're cooped up in a very like industrial system. But if they're allowed to do what they're supposed to do and be integrated in nature and living alongside other animals, they are actually they're part of nature. They contribute to restoring soil quality, and I think that a lot of our thinking around that is totally ass backwards. But it's just easy to fall in the camp of cows are bad because that's what people are told, because that's like how the established narrative is. There's a really good book out there that I would recommend people reading. It's called Defending Beef. I think the author came on our show. Her name is Nicolette Nyman. And she really breaks it down. So she was a environmental lawyer. She used to be vegan. When she was writing the book, she was vegan, but she was writing the case for defending beef. And she breaks it down into the 3 categories which you hear the most criticism about beef, which is the environmental argument, the nutritional argument, and then the humanitarian argument. And I think that her book is the best representation and like full breakdown of why beef is actually good for the environment.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to check that out. Can you talk a bit about, the illusion of choice we have at the grocery store?
Yeah, there's that interesting graph that I hope you can potentially put in the show notes here. But essentially, like most food products that are presented to you in the inner aisles of the grocery store are controlled by 8 to 10 players. Those are the big multinational food companies that basically create every product that you see on the inner aisles of the grocery store. And the illusion of choice phrase really just speaks to this concept of, you think you have all these options that are available to you. There's so many different choices, but at the end of the day, all these products are generally coming from 3 crops: corn, soy, and wheat. And they're coming from 8 to 10 companies. So when you think you're, living in this land of abundance, it's really just the same 3 crops remarketed, rehypothecated through these different companies' marketing teams, and spit out into different products that they then sell to you as, some new fancy product that's going to make you healthier or be like a staple of your breakfast, some staple breakfast cereal. And it's really just not the case.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. I want to ask you, so then should we all eat the same ratio of foods? Like, should we all just eat red meat and salt? How much should we experiment with our own diet?
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent. I mean, this is a huge part of my food journey, is I think people should be very open to the idea of experimenting with themselves when it comes to food. And as long as it's real food, I think that the parameters of you experimenting can be very wide. Like, anywhere from raw milk to, kale. You should experiment with the food that you put in your body as long as it's real food. I think that everyone has a different species appropriate diet. We all came from different places. I think seasonality is a massively underappreciated aspect of food and how we think about food. And so what I mean by that is, like, we as people obviously evolved from hunter and gatherers, from these tribes of people who are very, communal. They would eat just things that were available to them, and seasonality would have been there was no other option, obviously, right? Like, you're not getting berries imported from some other country. And I think that, for the most part, all of us have different foods that we can tolerate. And so, like, my example for that is, like, if you've ever gone out and gotten a drink with someone who has Asian nationality, they get this glow when they have some sort of alcohol in their system, or alcoholic drink. And it's because they don't have the enzyme that processes alcohol, or one of the enzymes that processes alcohol, and it just processes differently. So I think that speaks to the fact that we're all different. Our diets are going to vary, but what I can tell you for a fact is that the amounts of highly processed sugar, highly processed fats, and highly processed grains is absolutely not what we would have been eating. And if we just focus on experimenting with real foods, I think a lot of people can find that diet that works for them. There's definitely consistencies and trends in terms of what we should and shouldn't be eating. I think that animal protein and animal fat should kind of be the basis of a lot of people's diets. And then from there, once you kind of, if I were to tell someone, if I was trying to give someone some practical advice on experimenting, start with an elimination diet where you're eating really just nutrient dense foods. So cut out all the processed foods, focused on like a higher fat diet. So for me, that would be like a lot of beef, a lot of eggs, chicken, bone broth. And then once you get to a point where you've kind of stabilized, like 2 weeks in, then start reintroducing some things that you might have thought were able to tolerate them before. But when you kind of hit that baseline of having eliminated these things from your diet, you might realize that, like, oh, wow, I didn't realize how much kale and broccoli and these carnivorous vegetables were actually affecting my body and my mood. So there's there's a lot there to unpack, but I think in general, like, the biggest battle that most people are facing today is just the battle against hyper palatable, highly processed foods. And if you can just eat real foods, you're going to be in a good spot.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. And let's unpack that a little bit. Let's get into the controversial stuff. So cast iron or steel?
Ooh, so I'm a recent convert. I like the steel pan. There's a carbon steel pan out there that like it changed my thinking around this whole topic, because I was a cast iron guy for like 3 years straight. Love the cast iron, but I've switched. The sear that you can get on the carbon steel pan is insane, and the cleanup's easy. Safety got to me. He definitely convinced me that the carbon steel is the way to go.
Okay, sounds good. What about butter, ghee, or tallow?
I'm a tallow fan. So I think tallow is the most underrated, underutilized cooking fat there is. It has some flavor to it. Ghee has a little flavor to it as well, butter as well, but butter burns at a lower smoke point. So, if you get that carbon steel pan going, the butter is just gonna smoke up. But I do love, like, my favorite thing to do is like sear it, kind of pat it steak dry, sear it dry, and then add some tallow and butter in afterwards, so it still melts onto the steak, or baste it in. But you got to get that sear, so you need to have that heat cranking on that carbon steel pan.
Okay, I can see that. Thinking, a little bit about, we were talking about how the animal's killed, the processing, and sort of the stress put on the animal. I really, that resonates with me a lot. I think that, if the animal's treated badly, any part of their life, I think it's almost sort of a karma or a spiritual energy being transferred to us. And maybe that macinates in the physical world through the stress and the hormones. But along those lines, though, and this is not an either or, but what are your thoughts? Because I know the meat mafia, we think about red meat, the red meat renaissance. So what are your thoughts about like pork, chicken, fish, and seafood?
Yeah, I eat it. I include it in my diet. I think, from my perspective, there's just not a whole lot of producers who are raising, and I mean this like in the sense that like I think a lot of like pork and chicken is just really hard to raise the right way unless it's being pastured. And there are local people that I buy from regularly who are doing it this way. But I try to avoid the corn and soy fed chicken and pork. But I'll eat it. I mean, I think that it's still a great food source, and it's better than the highly processed foods. But fish as well. But fish, again, like, it needs to be wild caught. There's a lot of pollution in the oceans, microplastics, heavy metals. So like, there's things to consider with that. But I definitely still include those in my diet. The reason that I tend to eat a lot more red meat is that it's very much easily available, and there's really high quality sources around me that I can get it from, regularly and consistently and reliably, from a quality perspective.
Okay. Yep. And then what about, it's not either or as well, but veganism, vegetarianism, pescatarianism, the Mediterranean diet, paleo, and keto. I mean, is not an either or, but what are your thoughts on these things?
Yeah, I feel pretty strongly about this. The whole dieting mindset in the US and kind of like culturally in general, we're just like looking to throw labels on things. And I think the labeling of these diets is a huge detriment to the consumer, the individual, and it's a massive channel that these big food companies can then go and market to you. So, if you go and look at any product in the grocery store, they're going to have all these different labels on them that's like vegan friendly, vegetarian friendly, all these things that are kind of projecting your values back on you. And I think it actually hurts the consumer. It makes you start thinking about diet in a way that's kind of strange. I think, we spend so much time thinking about what we should be eating, and I don't think we would have been thinking that way just 100 years ago. I think it would have been very natural in considering what we should and shouldn't eat. And so we're kind of like moving into this era of like this like hypnotic state of like people just getting dogmatic about their diets, and it really should just be thought of as a lifestyle. And that's why I kind of like try to create a range for people to start thinking about this stuff. It's like, remove the processed foods, focus on real foods. If you're playing in that arena, you're doing well. I think there's definitely rights and wrongs when you're playing in that arena still, but if you're avoiding the processed foods, you're definitely on the right side of the equation. And then, for me, it's like, the vegan, vegetarian movement, the pescatarian diets, I just don't think the labels really help anyone. It just makes things more dogmatic, and we should be having a kind of higher level conversation around food.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then what about like fasting, intermittent fasting, and kind of just versus grazing?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of fasting. It's worked well for me personally. I know other people have had their own experiences with it. I think for women, it can be problematic. I can't really speak to that from a personal, from a anecdotal experience, but like I know a lot of women who have said like it's messed them up hormonally, and there's research behind that as well. But I think fasting is a great tool. Like it teaches you how to be a little bit more intentional with your food. And I also think that going into a period of ketosis is a really powerful tool for people. Ketosis is the state that you get into when you've been fasting for about 12 hours, 12 to 16 hours. And those ketones are like, it's like a shot of black coffee to the brain, helps you focus. You get into a little bit more of like a survival mode. And I do think that feeling is a very natural program that our body innately gets into for a reason, and we should tap into that from time to time. So I'm a huge fan of fasting. I think that there's a lot of benefits neurologically. Your body goes through a process called autophagy, which basically cleans your body out of damaged cells and goes through a repair process when you kind of shut down the digestive process. And I think that's really, really a powerful tool. And also, yeah, like digestion takes up a ton of energy from your brain and body's ability to function. So like if you can kind of narrow the window that you're consuming calories in, it just plays a massive role in your overall energy stability throughout the day. You don't have those crazy crashes up and down. You probably won't be as reliant on coffee to get your energy. You'll feel a little bit more steady throughout the day. So there's definitely something to that, and I'm a big proponent.
Okay, yeah, I can see that as well. What about grass-fed versus grain-fed?
Yeah, this is a highly controversial topic in the carnivore community. So I think that grass-fed is the best, and then, grain-fed is good. I'm trying to get more people to consider eating meat. So I definitely think that both play their role. There's an amazing researcher out of Utah State called Stefan Van Vliet, and he's done a lot of research on the micronutrient profile of grass-fed beef compared to grain-fed beef. And it turns out that the micronutrient profile of grass-fed beef is higher than grain-fed. And I also think that, people like their cuts of meat. And if you're just starting your diet journey and you are really focused on, just trying to like control your willpower, and you need to have your ribeye every day or your specific cut of meat every day, most of the time that's going to be something that you get from the grocery store that's grass-fed, grain finished. So there's nothing wrong with that, but there are trade-offs. I think that the people who are doing it grass-fed, grass finished see the whole picture, where they're doing the best thing for the land, they're doing the best thing for people. And all in all, I think that product in general is better for us in every sense. So, a fan of both, but, grass-fed, grass-finished is definitely my choice.
Okay. And what about the organic label? Is that healthier?
It's been so greenwashed. It's greenwashed to the point where you couldn't really say if it's healthier or not, because one product could be organic and it's perfectly healthy. I think organic just means that it's not sprayed with herbicides and pesticides, but it still can include a whole bunch of other things. And so, yeah, I think the organic label has kind of lost its power recently. So I would not make my decisions around food based on the organic label.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that. What about fruits and veggies? Are they all good for me?
I think for the most part, fruits are fine, are good for you. The thing that you're going to run into with vegetables is that, these are plants that typically don't want to be eaten. And so they're going to have plant defense chemicals in them that make an animal that's going to be going, walking past it, grazing on it, not want to eat it. And so for the most part, there are a lot of vegetables out there that people think are healthy for them that just generally shouldn't be eaten. And I would include nuts in that. There's a lot of defense chemicals, oxalates that eventually just end up causing inflammation in the body. And inflammation is the precursor to a lot of these other negative health outcomes. So I think, are vegetables going to kill you? No. Are vegetables fine to include in your diet? Yes. But I would just be mindful of how you prepare them. So there's like always a process that needs to go in place when you're eating vegetables. I wouldn't eat them raw. I would ferment them or cook them down, pretty substantially. And, that comes at a cost. You lose a little bit of the nutrient profile with that. But, if you're processing those vegetables the right way, you can definitely work around some of the plant chemicals that I was talking about.
Yeah, I can see that. So again, I want to emphasize that we're talking, rough guidelines here, not health advice per se, and speaking about others, not necessarily ourselves. So just in terms of, what are your thoughts on alcohol, wine, or beer? Cut it all out? Are there differences between them?
Yeah, I think the big problem with the alcohol industry today is it's a lot like the rest of the food industry, where it's very highly industrialized and commoditized to the point where the grains that they're using are sprayed with all sorts of herbicides and pesticides. And so when those go into the processing facilities to create beer, wine, other alcoholic beverages, they're generally not the highest quality. And I think a lot of the alcohol that particularly like college kids are drinking today, it's like the cheap stuff, and it's the malt liquors, it's the, these spiked seltzers have become popular. It's essentially flavored malt liquor, which is the cheapest form of liquor and alcohol. And so if the vast majority of people are eating that cheap or drinking that cheap stuff, that's the worst quality of alcohol for you. But I do also think, there's a balance component to this. And if you are going to choose to drink, drinking affects your sleep, which is a core aspect of being healthy. So you're kind of accepting that, you're going to get less quality sleep. But I do think that there are types of alcohols out there. There's, companies who are doing things the right way in terms of how they make their alcohol, and types of alcohol that are actually better choices when you do choose to drink. So like, for instance, there's a company out there called Dry Farm Wines. It's a little bit lower percentage alcohol on their wine, but it's, all their wine is from plants that aren't sprayed. It's typically a drier wine, hence the name. And you aren't getting a lot of the sugar and like concentrated sugar additives that get put in the alcohol during the process. So I found that those wines are great, and really kind of choosing to drink those has solved a lot of problems that come with drinking, because usually a lot of like the hangovers and poor sleep is just related to these drinks just being loaded with sugar and additives that you're not intending to get, but they just put them in there because it's a cheap part of the process.
Right on. And then along the same lines, smoking cigarettes, marijuana, vaping, or just complete abstention?
Yeah, I have I couldn't promote any of those as part of a healthy lifestyle. I think there probably used to be a place for nicotine in some cultures. Like I look at certain cultures who would smoke like pure tobacco, and I do think that like it wasn't always a bad thing, but anything that you're putting into your lungs and inhaling is just getting purely oxidized in the body, and it's causing stress. Now, I think it's everyone's choice to do what they want to do, but that's something that I would avoid.
Gotcha. And then along those lines, the sugar?
Yeah, I think, processed sugar to me is like one of the the one of the biggest setbacks for our health. I think it's addictive, and it has a similar dopamine reaction to some drugs. And so a lot of the problems that I think we face today are based around people being addicted to sugar and not really understanding their relationship with food and how sugar has actually kind of rewired their brain in a way. And it makes, I think, addiction is addiction. So like if you're easily susceptible to being addicted to sugar, there's a whole host of other things that you can get addicted to pretty easily. So, sugar is something that I do consume, but very sparingly. And I'm pretty mindful of like how I'm consuming it. Like it's either like raw honey, berries, fruits, raw milk. Occasionally there will be a sweet or two around the holidays, but I just think it's one of those things. It's like a pretty slippery slope for most people. And if you can abstain from it, it'll definitely serve your health the best in the long run.
Yeah, along those lines, Toxic Bitcoiner asked on Noster, to what degree is fruit honey necessary and evolutionary consistent a la Saladino? How do athletics and exercise affect its necessity?
Yeah, I think there's something interesting with fruit and honey that we kind of miss. And I was trying to hit on it a little bit earlier, but it's like the seasonality component. And what I mean by that is that fruit and honey would not have been something that would have been available to us year round. And so there would have been a certain time of year where we would have been eating a lot more fruit and honey. And that time of year is springtime when the sun is out, the days are longer. And there's actually a really interesting study out there that connects vitamin D levels with our glucose metabolism. And so when our vitamin D levels are higher, we have a more efficient system at digesting carbohydrates. And I think that there's a lot more detail and nuance that goes into our thinking around how we consume fruit and honey than we realize. But what I would say is, for me, I always have some sort of fruit and honey craving during the summer when I'm out in the sun a lot, when my vitamin D levels are higher because I'm out in the sun a lot. And so I think that there's something to that. I don't think people should be necessarily sitting around and just like hammering fruit and honey all the time. But I do think that it's a part of a healthy, balanced diet for sure.
Yeah, on a side note, I've really gotten into honey lately. I don't have it that often. It happens to be sunny here most of the year, but this purveyor at the local farmers market, he's offering honey from by the beach, honey from the orange groves, a mixture of all of them for allergies. It's I'm making my way through the collection. I'm having fun.
Nice.
To turn to a little bit heavier of a topic, though, what about, and I'm going to include these together, soy milk versus pasteurized milk versus raw milk?
Yeah. So soy milk, I wouldn't even consider consuming. Pasteurized milk, I grew up drinking pasteurized milk. I don't think any of these things are going to be the things that kill you, but I think if you're trying to make the right food choices, there's a clear right answer in my mind. And unfortunately, it's the one that's hardest to get. I think raw milk is one of these things, again, like cholesterol, that got a bad rap during one certain period of time. And then we've just allowed this narrative to continue and persist. So like if you go to the FDA website and look up raw milk and the safety of raw milk, you'll get all these crazy theories about why raw milk isn't safe to consume. But the reality is it's very safe to consume as long as you're getting it from a high quality provider and producer, someone who really cares about how, the health of the cow. If that's a healthy cow, the milk is going to be healthy for you to consume. The history of raw milk is something that we can get into, but it's interesting because, we went through a period of massive growth during the 1800s as a country, and the food supply needed to expand at the same rate. And the main food that we relied on in terms of kind of like feeding the young and also food for adults was milk. And at the time, pasteurization wasn't a thing. And so what happened was we started cramming all these cows in very, very tight quarters where they wouldn't even move their entire lives. They would be shoulder to shoulder in these barns, and we were feeding them brewer's waste. So what was happening was these brewers, producing beer, were struggling, and they were looking for secondary or other ways to make money. And so they brought these cows in as a way to subsidize their brewing business, and they didn't really care about the product at all. There's a really interesting book that describes like what the milk actually looked like, and it was essentially not milk. It was like these cows had like boils, and the milk color was like purple. They would color it with chalk. And so raw milk got a bad rap after that because it wasn't even really milk. It was just like this disgusting byproduct from these sick animals. And it made a lot of people sick. And then they regulated it, overregulated it. And now we have pasteurization, which essentially takes a lot of the valuable enzymes and nutrients out of the milk. It denatures the proteins in the milk. And like, honestly, like I grew up drinking pasteurized milk. I don't plan on drinking it if I don't have to. Raw milk is definitely my preference.
Couple questions there. One, I don't even really like pasteurized milk per se. I don't know how I would adjust to raw milk. I don't know what that is like. And then I just don't have a lot of it in my diet. But what is this? How is this related to lactose intolerance? I tell people I'm lactose annoyed, by the way. But
I like that. I think it's very much related. The dairy industry in the US is, I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but it's like, it's the same system that is similar, same problem in the chicken industry, the poultry industry. It's very industrialized. And so, the milk needs to be pasteurized, and a lot of these animals aren't all that healthy to begin with. So, you're talking about unhealthy animals providing you milk, then they're heating it up so that there aren't any contaminants in the milk. I think that's probably a massive reason why people are running into lactose intolerant issues. There's also another component of this, which is, a lot of the cheese in the US is loaded with preservatives. Like if you left cheese out on your counter from, any large scale manufacturer of cheese, Kraft, let's say, the time that it would take for that to mold is not normal. If you had like a raw piece of cheese from, the farmer's market, that's going to mold pretty quickly. And compare that to the Kraft cheese, which will probably stay on your counter and not mold for a few weeks. I think that speaks to how our body would digest that, right? Our gut is filled with trillions of small organisms that help in the digestive process, that aid in the digestive process. They eat up the food that we consume and put in our mouth. And that when we put something on the counter and the shelf life is short, I generally think that's probably a pretty good indication of the overall quality of the food. Like short shelf life to me means that it's a higher quality food. So, I think that raw milk for a lot of people, there is kind of this gestation period where you have to get used to like moving over to a higher like a food that has way more enzymes than you're probably used to. But the good thing about raw milk is it contains the enzyme that actually breaks down lactose. So I think it's lactobacilli. Its role is to break down that lactose before it goes into your gut. So there's, I think, a huge misconception around lactose intolerant, and a lot of it is just derived from pasteurization.
Okay, I can see that. And then, but the flip side to this around the soy, what about estrogenic chemicals in our food system and even in the environment? How is that impacting us?
Yeah, we had a guy on our podcast who wrote the book called Estrogeneration. His name is Dr. Anthony J. So he's the specialist on this topic, but it really blew my mind learning, what he knows about this topic, from cosmetics, your deodorant, your shampoos, to drinking water, to the food system. even like, microplastics that we come into encounter with all the packaging that's around us. The water, I think, is really like the big one where if you don't have a water filter, and if you're not paying attention to your drinking water, you're probably running into a decent amount of estrogenic chemicals, whether it's, water that has not gotten all of the, birth control, out of it. Like, there's a number of estrogenic chemicals, but essentially those chemicals, once they are in your body, they end up raising your estrogen levels and throwing your testosterone to estrogen ratio out of whack. And that's when we start actually having these like male feminization traits that end up happening and manifesting over a long enough period of time. I think like the skincare one is another huge one that people aren't really privy to. Anything you put on your skin bypasses the digestion process. And so it goes directly into your bloodstream. So if you're putting, oxybenzone filled products on from your skincare company, or chemicals like different parabens that are in your skincare products, you're going to run into this issue of estrogenic effects. So that's a huge one. I think it's often overlooked, and the drinking water is a huge one.
And then, along those lines, what are you seeing in men with low testosterone?
Yeah, we had a really great conversation with this company called Blokes about this. And, 3 decades ago, our testosterone levels on average were about 200 points higher than they are today. And, the effects of low testosterone are generally things that you associate with male traits, like, like higher charging energy, where you're like, really, ambitious and like these like full of life. But it's not to say like, women need testosterone as well, and they're actually facing a different problem, because the estrogenic compounds in a lot of the food, drinking water, cosmetic products are raising their estrogen levels and kind of causing the inverse. So like men are kind of becoming less and less masculine, women are becoming more and more masculine, and it's something that this guy, Dr. Anthony J, talks about a lot in his book. But yeah, the decline of testosterone is definitely entirely lifestyle and diet related. I think it has a lot to do with how we think about food. And I think it ties a lot back to how we think about animal-based foods in our diet, and how over the last several decades we've kind of demonized them wrongfully so. And there's a lot of examples of people out there men and women, who have been struggling with hormonal problems, like women missing their period because they want a vegan diet, and then they start incorporating animal meats again. They start incorporating organ meats, and all of a sudden their cycle's back. Or for men, that they start to see their testosterone increase again. And like these are essential hormones for not just living a good life, but our reproductive health and overall health. So, I think what we're seeing is really like a product of the food system being broken, and us not really understanding what we should and shouldn't eat, which is pretty sad.
You also mentioned lifestyle there. What about with like, even like, especially like young people and their lifestyle? How does that affect maybe their testosterone with maybe like even blue light or something?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the blue light topic, but what I can say is, if you're not getting ample amount of sunlight, if you're not being active, you're really not putting yourself in a position to be the healthiest version of yourself. And I think that, hormone production at a young age is definitely being affected by more sedentary lifestyles. And blue light is definitely one of those things that, it's a more nuanced topic, but we're being exposed to it at a higher level than we ever have. in particular around times that we're highly sensitive to it. So nighttime, morning time. And I think that it's an essential part of, our biological system. Our circadian rhythm is really set around light exposure. And so like, when we do set our circadian rhythm properly, get morning sunlight, it actually affects our sleep quality. So like all of these things, sleep is essential for hormone health. It's really like where our body goes into repair mode and builds muscle. So all of these things are interconnected and playing off of kind of the same equation, but it's hard to, isolate one thing in a vacuum without looking at the big picture, which I think is like kind of how most people look at their health.
Yeah. Have you looked at maybe birth control and fertility, birth control pills?
Yeah. Again, not my area of expertise, but it's something that we've had a few conversations on the podcast about, and it's something I'm interested in talking a lot more about because, the idea of putting prepubescent or like, not matured woman on birth control to me is like, it's crazy. These are hormones that we're basically giving to kids who are then told that these birth control pills kind of like solve. It's like, I've heard multiple stories of people getting birth control for reasons that like aren't even really related to the underlying purpose of the pill to begin with. Like it's kind of this like silver bullet that these doctors prescribe. And I think what a lot of people don't really realize is that if you're tracking your cycle, and again, by no means an expert on this, but if you're tracking your cycle, there's really only like 3 to 5 days where you're fertile. And so, obviously there's other considerations there, but I think again, like in terms of balancing and regulating hormones and kind of like letting our natural genes express themselves, like pumping yourself full of hormones is likely not like the right solution in my mind.
Do you think all this that we've been talking about is like, do you think our bodies are changing, particularly with young people?
Absolutely. I think, yeah, it starts with the food, but then again, like the drugs that we're pumping into kids, vaccines as well, like these all play a massive role in our genetic composition and how our body express themselves. And I think that what we're quickly realizing is that 93% of people are metabolically unhealthy. By all accounts, that's failing massively. That wouldn't pass any test. And so at a larger degree, like things are getting worse and worse for younger kids. And I think we're going to run into a serious fertility problem here if we don't wake up to it. And again, I think there's probably going to be a massive opportunity for people to put a Band-Aid on that. And, there'll be like fertility clinics and all these sorts of things that come in and try to save the day. But at the end of the day, the root cause is our lifestyle and our diets, and things can be reversed, but our genes are totally impacted by the food that we eat and the lifestyles that we live. So, if we're inside more, if we're eating higher foods that are higher in sugar, higher in grains, higher in processed fats, that's going to affect future generations without a question.
Yeah, so then what about the importance of gut health?
It's huge, and it's I think it's kind of this black box that it's not well understood. There's a lot of people doing great research on it now, but it's still something that is not widely understood. And I think it is because it's like a simple yet complex system. There's, the relationship between the gut and the brain. They say the gut is the second brain. There's a lot of immune function that happens in the gut. And like, that's like the old saying that Hippocrates had, which is like your health starts in the gut. And I generally think that we can probably, for most people, leave it at that, where, our gut health is really like the most important aspect of our health. It's how we absorb food. And the sad thing is now a lot of people are exposed to extreme amounts of toxins, pesticides, glyphosate, herbicides, and those are the types of things that end up, deteriorating our gut lining. And if you listen to Dr. Zach Bush, he's a great reference on this. He talks in detail about how he thinks glyphosate is the big player in breaking down our gut wall and causing things like leaky gut and all these different autoimmune diseases that are starting in the gut, like Crohn's, IBS, ulcerative colitis. These things weren't all that common just a few decades ago, but they're becoming more and more common. And for the most part, it's because the toxins that are in chemicals that are getting sprayed on our food.
Wow, it seems a little overwhelming at times, what we're up against. Just to keep it simple. So how does Bitcoin fit into all this for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So I think when you try to play the game of first principles, you quickly realize that even if you're talking about the world of food, everything comes back to money. And so when I was thinking about the food system and all the things that are wrong with it, the first thing that became abundantly clear to me was the high levels of concentration in the food system from big multinational companies controlling all the different aspects of food production. And when that happens, it's usually a product of a few things, but it really is just a product of the incentives are promoting and subsidizing fewer and fewer people controlling more and more. And so, if you look at a lot of the government subsidies around food, they're really steered towards promoting the production of corn, soy, and wheat, which is what we talked about earlier, is this concept of weaponizing food. And I think that really is a powerful realization when, you think about government dollars that are, going towards initiatives that should be helping people and, supporting vibrant life in our country. And we actually have like the opposite, where we're incentivizing the production of these highly processed industrialized crops that are monocrop crops that aren't good for the land, that aren't good for people. And it's the money that's driving that market. It's not the free market that's deciding why we should be eating those foods. And so that realization for me was kind of what made me realize that we need to fix the subsidies. And I think that, for a lot of people, they would maybe go and think about, putting together some sort of lobbying group in DC and trying to fight the existing regulation. But I generally think that we've gotten to the point where we need to start building the next layer of, what the world's going to look like. And I think the best way for us to do that is by looking at it through the Bitcoin lens, which is, when I talked about the food system, I mentioned ground up, bottom up systems versus top down systems, and Bitcoin is bottoms up money that, we need to rely on each other and have this trust in the system. But beyond that, there's no one who's controlling it. And I think the outcomes from using Bitcoin as money will have a profound effect on the food quality and just the quality of life in general. But for me, there's also another component to this, which is a lot of people who are raising food don't want to have to deal with the government intervening with how they raise their food and, what they can and can't raise. And, the USDA has a pretty strong foothold in what is produced. And I think that having money that basically can, operate peer to peer is a big factor for food producers. And that's just another component that I think about with this. But I think food is the currency of last resort in all things. And so food providers in general might not have to adopt Bitcoin until everyone else has already had to adopt Bitcoin. But I do think that the food providers who are already thinking about this, farmers who are thinking about maybe preserving some of their wealth in Bitcoin, could be massive net beneficiaries of what's to come with the financial system. Because, I think that there's, this problem in the food system where a lot of farmers are aging out of food production. So there's this whole new, we basically need these old farmers to teach a whole new generation of farmers, and like those people don't really exist. So, we're lacking like this skill set as well. But I do think that there's kind of this reawakening around food, which is optimistic and exciting. Like there's a lot of people who are getting involved and seeing it more as a mission as opposed to a way to monetize, like a way to live a better lifestyle if they can work remotely and create healthy food for them and their family and their local community. So I think there's this whole new wave of people homesteading and things like that. But yeah, I think, Bitcoin does play a key role in the future of food for sure.
Speaking of sort of a mission and autonomy and sovereignty, can you tell me about this Amish farmer who started a private membership association who was on your show, Mr. Miller?
He wasn't on our show, but I can tell you what I know about him. So Amos Miller owns a Amish farm in Pennsylvania, and the USDA recently cracked down on him because he's trying to raise his food as God intended, and he has a whole customer list that he ships to across the country that are members of his of his community, and he ships them food that's not processed. He's able to work around the USDA processing facilities because these people are members of his farm from the community perspective. And so since they're members, he's able to avoid going through the USDA processing facility. And he's a large player in this kind of like anti-USDA movement. And so they cracked down on him relatively recently, and he's been putting up a fight. I think they just got some good news a few weeks ago in December. But, they're like, we're trying to shut him down. And, there's a video of them showing up at his property and searching without really any sort of cause or reason. But it's because he's not really playing by their rules, and that bothers them.
Yeah, they love when you play by their rules. A lot of rules out there and a lot of pressure. So then how do you think stress is affecting digestion and health?
It's kind of like the quiet killer. Stress from like oxidative stress to stress that, you're just lifestyle stresses. It's it plays a role in how your body, really functions and regulates itself. So like sleep again is like the ultimate moderator of stress. A lot of minerals that we're lacking in the soil, we're lacking in our diets, are stress regulators, like specifically magnesium. And, these are like kind of precursor building blocks for us managing stress. And ultimately, these are things that affect our hormone regulation. If you're stressed out, your hormones are all out of whack. Something that we talked about with this fellow named John Constas on our podcast. He's big into the idea of regulating stress before everything else, because it's one of these things that affects your ability to make the right choice, to get enough sleep, and even just beyond the science, like there's this almost psychological effect of like you being able to make the right food choices based around stress. A lot of people I know who have IBS or who have had problems with autoimmune issues like ulcerative colitis, they talk about how stress has ability to trigger these autoimmune issues. So like stress alone is a massive factor when it comes to your health and your digestion. And so, I mean, this is another lifestyle component. Like, are you getting enough sleep? Are you going and getting enough exercises and promoting the good types of stresses in your life so that you don't have these, stresses that are caused usually by some balance between your diet and your lifestyle.
I can see that being just powerfully hard to, yeah. So then, few more questions here. I mean, do you have thoughts on the food production fires, and even seems to be this latest, I don't know if it's a viral thing, but just with eggs, and don't eat eggs. Eggs are low in production right now. The chicken feed might not be good. I mean,
yeah, I've seen some stuff pop up on my timeline, but I haven't looked into it all that much. Yeah, but the egg stuff's real. I mean, there's like a decent, there's a pretty big like egg shortage right now. And a lot of it is because there was an avian flu that came in and killed a large percentage of the chickens in the US, and we're feeling the ramifications of that now. Like, you can only buy 2 cartridges of eggs at the grocery store in most places, and it's interesting. I mean, most places are just completely out of stock, so it's very real for the consumer. I don't necessarily know, from like a nefarious perspective, if it's anything like that. I know that the avian flu came in a few months ago and really hit a lot of these big providers of eggs and chicken pretty hard. So yeah, not good. I mean, the price of eggs have like tripled. So
right. So maybe the $64 million question is for people trying to maybe lose weight. Is it more about what you put in your body or how you exercise your body?
I think 100% what you put in your body. I think so. Yeah, I mean, my take on this is that they're obviously very interrelated. I think that you can start by being someone who works out more, and then ultimately you fix your diet and you improve your health. I think ultimately what you'll realize is that no matter how much you want to work out in the gym, the best results, the longest lasting results will always start in the kitchen. And so if you don't have that buttoned up, it's hard to prioritize exercising before that. Now, I think like a lot of these things, there's a little bit more nuance. Like, sometimes working out more can just be the spark that you need to hold yourself more accountable to eat better and make those food choices more intentionally, because you feel a little bit more obliged because you're putting in the effort in the gym. So for me, I could make both arguments, but I think over a long enough period of time, for people who are trying to play the long game, you got to have the kitchen buttoned up. Like, that's where it all starts. That's where it all ends. And ultimately, I think it's the best investment you can make. Like, if you're spending time and giving that, food production for yourself and your family the attention that it needs, like, everyone who's you're closest surrounded with, your immediate family, you yourself, will benefit from having that high quality food on the table. You can't really say that for the exercise component. And so there's some positive kind of like communal element of that as well. Like, you can make your family and your friends healthier by, choosing to really lean into the food angle.
So then, is eating good boring?
I don't think so. I think once you kind of rewire your thinking around it, you can always make it exciting. Like, I think cooking is one of those endless passions, right? Like, you can invest as much time as you possibly can in the world. It's like a martial arts. Like, you can always find something to improve on when it comes to cooking. And I think if you take that mindset, you'll always find ways to make cooking more and more enjoyable. You'll find new ingredients to incorporate. You'll find new techniques to include. You'll find new tools to use when you're cooking, open fire, cast iron, there's all sorts of ways to make cooking more enjoyable. And I think that the eating part of it, like is eating healthy boring? It can be for some people. I think like those people are probably generally used to eating foods that are made by like a food scientist. So they expect their food to have, cool ranch flavoring instead of, like a tender, satiating piece of meat. So
I see what you're saying there. So to round this out, you have a great tweet, your pinned tweet. It says meat, fruits, eggs, organs, oysters, marrow, raw dairy, raw honey, bone broth, orange juice, dark chocolate, fermented veggies. Walk much, lift heavy, rest often, breathe more, sunbathe, create community. This is the way in on. We didn't get into everything here. We didn't get into organs, marrow, bone broth. I like that you have orange juice because I've heard a lot of bad things about juice, but I really like juices and orange juice in particular. And I love dark chocolate. I don't understand the fermented veggies, but we'll let that slide. But you also have a great piece, 10 things you can do today to improve your health forever. So I'll read through these, and if you want to comment. So the first one is buy a shower filter.
Yeah. So one of the crazy things. So I mentioned the drinking water. The water that you're putting on your skin from the shower filter is much more highly prone to vaporizing, and when it vaporizes and turns into a gas, that's when chlorine actually seeps through your skin and gets directly into your blood. So, like, for me, the shower filter is more important than a drinking water filter because you're bathing in it, and that's when these like toxic chemicals that are in the tap water actually infiltrate. So I think it's just a low-hanging fruit investment for anyone who's trying to be healthier.
Yeah, I don't know what the price point on something like that is, but there is a quote here. There is a lot of well-founded concern about chlorine. When chlorine is added to our water, it combines with other natural compounds to form, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, THMs. These chlorine byproducts trigger the production of free radicals in the body, causing cell damage, and are highly carcinogenic. Although concentrations of these carcinogens, these THMs, are low, it is precisely these low levels that cancer scientists believe are responsible for the majority of human cancers in the United States. The next one is read a one-page daily.
Yeah, I think there's something simple to having some concrete established parts of your day. And I think reading and just like taking some time to pause is really important. We kind of get caught up in our day-to-day lives, and this is kind of like my lifestyle hack is just like slow down, read a page of a book. It probably will turn into longer than one page. And it's amazing what that one staple of your day can do in terms of you making better decisions, you having more willpower, you getting a small win under your belt. So that's kind of where I was coming from with that one.
Yeah, I like that. And it's like, you're just like, bro, one page, what kind of advice is that? But before you jump to conclusions, you'll explain that the logic is, habit formation, 1 page a day results in 365 pages in a year, which is about a book. Most 25% of Americans don't even go a calendar year without reading a book. It's a small time commitment, so you can kind of accomplish this task, and it's not a big investment, and forces you to slow down. And maybe you could even focus on a book that forces a deeper level of thinking for your 1 page a day, maybe something about philosophy, prose, or some sort of history book. Clemenza finds that these books typically contain dense wisdom that gives you 1 to 2 things to focus on throughout the rest of your day. What about investing in a water filter for your tap water?
Yeah, same along the same vein as the shower filter. It's just low-hanging fruit. I think the damage that's done in terms of the water that we consume is massive, and these are just things that involve the reason it's on here is it's things that involve no willpower. All you have to do is just make the purchase, and it'll have a positive effect on your health.
All right, and you have a Berkey water filter. I don't know what the price point on that is, but I can see the benefit of this. And then, so next one is you're saying we should go to bed before 10 p.m. You're trying to be a buzzkill.
Yeah, total buzzkill. Consistency in the schedule is huge. It's not practical for a lot of people. Everyone's schedule is different. There's different demands pulling at everyone. But at the end of the day, if you can let your head hit the pillow at the same time every night, it makes it easier to wake up at the same time every morning. And you're kind of committing to, not staying up late, maybe snacking, letting those bad habits start to linger in, the more tired you get. And again, like sleep is the bedrock to health. So before 10 p.m., I think
You guys note over the last 100 years, the average amount of sleep we are getting has dropped by a full hour. The effects of sleep deprivation on the mind and body are quite killer, with problems such as memory issues, trouble with thinking and concentration, mood changes, can lead to accidents, weakened immunity, high blood pressure, weight gain, risk for diabetes, risk of heart disease, poor balance, and low sex drive. So get some sleep. And what about, you say we should meditate for 3 minutes daily? Why is that?
I think so. For me, mindfulness and breathing is a really important part of that stress management that you were talking about. And nose breathing in particular is really a great stress controller. So just spending some time consciously focusing on breathing, seeing, what's top of mind, I think is, again, kind of similar to that reading 1 page a day. Just stillness, letting yourself kind of like de-stress, have baked into your day, between minutes of meditation and one page of reading. You're talking about 5 minutes of just committing to not letting your day take you for a ride. So I think there's something to just like sitting, doing nothing, focusing on breathing. It's definitely a stress regulator. So I promote it highly for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But you also want me to keep a simple food journal. That seems like a lot of work. What benefit am I going to get out of this?
Yeah, I don't think you need to do it for long, but I do think if you're experimenting with an elimination diet or changes in your diet, it helps to track how your body's reacting to it, just so you can come back to it and kind of be mindful of it. There's this like intuition that we have around food, but we've lost it. And so I think keeping a food journal lets us build that intuition back up and start to understand how our body and how our mind is reacting to the foods that we're putting in our body. So just keeping tabs on things, making mental notes of different feelings that you're having after you have certain foods. I think it's worth doing for a few weeks. Don't need to do it all the time.
Yeah, reading through this, I could see. So you're saying, we should know protein amount. So we should be shooting for 1 gram of protein for every pound of body weight. Time of day, kind of given to, insights into how food affects your energy during the day and your sleep quality. You recommend not eating for 2 to 3 hours prior to sleeping, and also trying to delay your first meal to benefit from some of the digestive benefits of a shortening eater window. And types of food, it's important to gauge and understanding how certain foods affect your mood, digestion, energy levels, skin health, and more. Do you recommend tracking calories?
No, I'm not a fan of tracking calories at all. If you're someone who's trying to make dieting a big part of your life, track calories. If you want to be dieting all the time, track calories. I think my philosophy is focus on eating nutrient dense foods. Don't track calories. Focus on understanding your energy levels based on the foods you're eating, and you won't really you won't have to worry about the pluses and minuses of how many calories you ate in a day. It's easier said than done. I think like a lot of people are up against much more than they realize when it comes to eating right. But the calorie model to me is just it gets people fixated on the wrong things. We should be thinking about macronutrients, micronutrients, minerals, vitamins, and calories are kind of this blanket term that can cover up a lot of things that still make you very unhealthy.
Right. And speaking of trying to be healthy, I mean, it seems like you want me to spend more time outside.
Absolutely.
Like, how much time are you talking about, and why? And I love being outside. I'm just joking, but
I think the benefits of being outside for 30 minutes a day are like astronomical when it comes to getting the vitamin D you need. I think it's only 30 minutes that you need. Someone can fact check me on that, but just a little bit of sun exposure, fresh air, as this all goes into that, the stress regulators again, hugely important in that. And again, vitamin D is considered a hormone by some people, and we produce it when we get sun exposure. And I think that a lot of people are cooped up inside these days. They're stressed out. They have anxiety. And a lot of that has to do with them having a vitamin D deficiency because they're not getting enough sunlight.
I could see that. Yeah, I mean, especially kids, maybe with the video screens and the iPads. But what about you say take the stairs instead of the elevator? So this one's easy for me. I love to walk. I love to walk. I love to jog and even sprint. But what about even putting those up against each other? Is there some benefit to walking over jogging and sprinting?
It's a really good question. I think walking is as good of an exercise as any, if you can do it consistently and for a long enough period of time, because it does. So I mean, if you're walking outside, you're outside for longer, you're doing low impact, steady state cardio. Generally, your heart rate will typically be in a fat burning zone. So you're utilizing energy stores without tapping into glycogen stores and over exhausting yourself. Like I think a lot of emphasis gets put on the gym, and a lot of people could get away with just walking an hour and a half a day, and eating right. So for me, like walking, taking the stairs, these sorts of things are just like little hacks that, if you're doing those and you're eating clean, you're going to be really, really healthy. Walking, again, another great stress regulator. Like I have some of my best and clearest thoughts and creative times when I'm walking and listening to a podcast. So I do think it's totally overlooked by a lot of people. They'd rather be like bench pressing 300 pounds when they should just go for a walk.
I love it. Yeah, I love to walk. One thing I've been trying to think about, you mentioned maybe going for like an hour and a half walk. I don't know if that's like what you were saying. Like I've heard the number like 10,000 steps.
Yeah, 10,000 steps, so about 5 miles, which if you're doing like 20-minute miles walking.
Because when you do the steps thing, it's like my step's probably bigger than my wife's step. And we're trying to figure out if we're going to, my 10,000 steps, she's probably going to have to do 13,000 steps to get there. So she's going to do a little extra work.
Right.
And I was trying to go over that. And then like you say, when we wake up, we should stretch for 5 minutes. Even before bed, I guess at the beginning and the end of the day, you're saying.
Yeah. Longevity is something that I think everyone wants. They don't want their body to break down as they age. And the best way you can take care of yourself outside of, eating right, walking, kind of these basic fundamentals of being healthy, is stretching and just, again, I liken this to like the meditation. It slows you down. You have to get into your body and understand like the things that are tight and where stress is accumulating in the body and how it's manifesting itself. So, your hips are tight. Okay, why are your hips tight? You're sitting too much. Okay, like, what do I need to do to de-stress and break up this tightness in my lower back and hip area? Like it just gets your mind thinking about the things that are happening in your body that aren't necessarily in your head, but they're still neurological. So there's this mind-body connection that happens when you stretch. And I think it's really, really powerful. It's why people love yoga. It's why, a lot of people are into the meditation stuff. They're able to feel their body and feel it through their mind in a lot of ways. Like, I think that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, I could see that. And I think Hippocrates once said, you wrote that Hippocrates once said that walking is the best medicine, and he could not be more right. You also mentioned a way to organize and how to implement these 10 investments in your health. So order 2 water filters, 1 for your shower, 1 for your drinking water. Create a simple morning routine to knock out 5 of these recommendations. Walk, read 1 page, stretch, spend time outside, and meditate. First thing in the morning or for the last half hour of the day. Become religious about 3 things. Bed before 10 p.m., always take the stairs, and keeping a food log. You guys go on to kind of summarize and say, the food system is corrupt and trying to poison us. So the meat mafia and the Bitcoin matrix.
That bluntly?
What?
Do we say it that bluntly?
I think I got this in a tweet or something, but maybe it's on, let's see.
No, I was just kidding. We say it all the time, so it's
right. So the food system is corrupt and trying to poison us. The meat mafia and the Bitcoin matrix will teach you how to fight back. Clemenza, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. I'll leave it to you for any parting words and to let people know where they could find you and how they can get in touch.
Yes, Cedric, likewise. This was a great combo and we covered a lot of ground. I'm glad glad we were able to be so expansive with this combo. So for people who are listening, who are interested in hearing more about us, we run the Meat Mafia podcast, my co-host Brett and I. Yeah, so you can find Brett and I, we have a Substack. It's called the Meat Mafia Podcast. So just go to Substack, look for us there. And then we're also on Twitter. My handle is @Clemenza. Brett's handle, the co-host of the Meat Mafia Podcast, is @Mr. Salazzo. Those are the best two places to find us. We tweet daily and are talking about all this stuff daily. So find us there, listen to the podcast. If you end up listening, please rate the podcast. We greatly appreciate it.
This has been so dope. Thank you so much, Clemenza.
Appreciate it so much. Thanks, Cedric.
Yo, thank you for listening. Please make sure that you're subscribed to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast so you don't miss out on any fresh and new content. I want to thank Clemenza for taking the time to come on the show. I also want to thank our sponsors, River, the Bitcoin Conference, and CoinKite for powering the show. If you're digging the chats, please subscribe, write a 5-star review, stream and boost the show on the Found app, and share links with your friends and family, because those are the best way to spread the word so I can keep grinding out thought-provoking conversations about Bitcoin. Greg Zaj, David Zell, Luke Broyles, and Muzz are all up next. Keep learning, keep stacking, and stay laser focused out there. This is Cedric. Peace.